Chapter 43. What does it cost to behold the beauty of the King? The Gospel by Dr. Pam Arlen and Dr. Mary Ho. The Gospel of the Kingdom being preached over the whole earth is the hope and plea of every believer and the high point of Matthew 24. In fact, Matthew 24 answers one of the critical questions that God's people have been asking since the foundation of the earth. What does it cost to see God's name be made great among the nations, from where the sun rises to where it sets? Malachi 1 verse 11. What will the generation that fulfills Matthew 24:14 have to endure in the last generation? In truth, we are privileged to be the generation that can say there is literally no time zone in which Jesus is not worshipped. However, within each time zone, there are dark pockets where Jesus is not known and worshipped. This should not be so. Although we love Matthew 24:14, we tend to avoid the rest of the chapter. This is because Jesus makes it clear there will be many calamities in the earth leading up to when God is finally glorified among all the peoples of the earth. For example, war on a global scale, famines and earthquakes, persecution and being put to death, hated by all nations. Many will renounce their faith. False prophets, increase in wickedness, love of most grow cold, multiplied lawlessness. Jesus makes it clear that this coming of the kingdom is not easy or tidy. However, this same passage, he gives us at least 5 ways that believers are to have true grit so that we stand firm until the end. 1. Jesus tells us to be mobile and nimble. He points out that we must be able to flee at a moment's notice. Verse 16. This advancement of the kingdom will take us off guard, so we must be ready for sudden opportunities and change our lives, priorities, and plans quickly. The current refugee crisis is one such opportunity. More Muslims have come to Christ in this century than in all centuries of Islam. Those who responded to the refugee crisis have seen many Muslims come to Christ, but many had to stop our regular work and respond to this opportunity born of upheaval. There will be other opportunities in the future, and we have to be ready to respond quickly to the move of God. In fact, it appears that these calamities might also create unprecedented opportunity for the establishment of kingdom movements, but only if the people of God are mobile and nimble. 2. Jesus tells us we will have to flee, but we can ask him for mercy in the midst of the difficulties. We are to be people of persistent power. This is not the kind of persistent prayer. This is not the kind of prayer that takes a few minutes, nor will this be the kind of prayer in which we beg God to act. This will be the sons and daughters of a king militantly battling alongside our Heavenly Father, Ephesians 6, against foes who are not seen but whose deeds are felt. This is the kind of prayer that is both hard and full of joy. 3. Jesus tells us to keep watch. Verse 42. This means being aware of the strategies that God is carrying out. We are warned to be aware of false prophets. How can we distinguish false prophets from real prophets? By knowing the heart of the King. He captures our heart, soul, and mind in strength, and when he does this, we have the power to be bold, to be brave, to live differently, love the unlovely, love our enemies, endure hardship. This 1 Corinthians 13 love is not a patient, resigned acquiescence, but an active, positive fortitude. It is the endurance of the soldier who, in the thick of the battle, who is undismayed. 4. Jesus tells us to be good, trustworthy servants, to give to those in need of food. The passage does not seem to be literally about food, but an analogy. Unlike natural famines, where we respond with food aid to assist the neediest, we often send workers who are supposed to relieve spiritual famine to places where there is an excess of spiritual resources. This analogy helps us to understand why we prioritize the neglected people of the earth. We have to be honest and ruthless with ourselves to see whether our Great Commission workers are truly working where the spiritual need is greatest. 5. Jesus tells us not to be attached to earthly things. He points out that we should not go back and get our things. Living this way is different than how our neighbors live. We live not for our own fleshly desires and entertainment, wealth, and beauty. Instead, we live for the beauty of the King. This means spending less time for our own pleasures, but instead working harder for the welfare of others, giving away our time and money, living for an unseen glory. To live for the beauty of the King will require sacrifice, extreme sacrifice. Sacrifice that hurts. However, with the sacrifice, Malachi 1 verse 11 says that in every place where his name is great among the nations, there is the fragrant incense of our pure offerings. No sacrifice is too great if it makes his name greater among the nations. Jesus' promise in Matthew 24:14 will be fulfilled. This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all peoples. Are we willing to make the sacrifices necessary to see this vision fulfilled in our generation? Epilogue. What is God calling you to do? By David Coles. Almost 2,000 years ago, Jesus gave his followers this marvelous promise. This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Matthew 24, verse 14. His disciple Peter wanted to make sure that God's people didn't miss the implication of Jesus' great promise implies action steps for every one of his followers. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speeding its coming. In our generation, God has poured out his Spirit to bring major strides towards the fulfillment of Jesus' promise. Disciples from all around the world have caught the vision and taken radical steps to make more disciples who make more disciples. In this book, you have seen just a few examples of the amazing work God is doing in our day. The question is, what will you do to take up your rightful place in fulfilling Jesus' great promise? What practical action steps would God's Spirit like to lead you into to help speed the day of Jesus' return? We invite you and challenge you. Don't simply close this book and feel blessed at reports of God's kingdom advancing in marvelous ways. Take some time to ask, Lord, what is my role in making disciples of all nations? What do you want me to do in my spheres of influence to increase disciple making? How can I invest my gifts, time, and resources to play a role in urgently bringing the gospel of the kingdom to every unreached people group and place through church planting movements? After you ask, take time to listen. God is very willing to answer and guide when his children ask questions like these. Finally, share with other people how you feel God leading you. Encourage those people to join you in this effort. Don't let the inspiration be like a fleeting glance in a mirror. Let this be a major step of obedience to increasingly orient your life and ministry around the reaching of all peoples for the glory of God.